everybody, and welcome to the third year of the Paisley Book Festival, which was developed as part of Future Paisley, which is a radical and wide-ranging approach to transforming the town's future. My name is Randall, and I'm here with Mary Paulson Ellis and C.S. Robertson, and we're going to investigate who gets to tell our stories after we've gone, which is fitting because this is the year of Scotland's stories, and the festival's theme is Stories That Make Us. Now, both our writers have written books that explore what the things we leave behind say about us, how our family stories shape us, and whether those scripts can be rewritten, cleaned up, if you will. They'll both read, we'll chat, you'll have a chance to ask questions, and the event will be followed by a signing at the back of the room. For anyone watching digitally on Catch-Up, you can visit the online festival shop at bookshop.org. And for everyone here in the room or watching later on, we thank you for attending. And if you're at all able to support the festival with a little extra donation, you can do so online via paisleybookfestival.com/support. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about our writers. Craig Robertson started out in journalism, a career that found him face-to-face with prime ministers and covering deaths, disasters, and national emergencies. So I say that's perfect training for crime writing. His debut, Randall, was shortlisted for the CWA New Blood Dagger and made the long list for the 2011 Novel of the Year. It went on to become a Sunday Times bestseller. Some of his subsequent novels include Cold Grave, Witness the Dead, Murderabilia, and Watch Him Die, and he is also one of the driving forces behind Bloody Scotland. His newest novel is called The Undiscovered Deaths of Grace Mcgill, and in it we meet Grace, who cleans up when people die alone and undiscovered. Her work deals with everything from bodily remains to a lifetime's clutter, complete with lifetime's dark secrets. She cleans up after one old man who had lay undetected in his flat for months, and as she does so, she realizes that he was not as unremarkable as he appeared to be on the surface. Something about him gets under her skin, and it's the impetus for a really dangerous hunt that leads to an investigation into the disappearance of a girl who vanished on Bute in the 1960s. Mary Paulson Ellis is the author of dual timeline detective novels about the world of those who die with no next of kin. Her debut novel, The Other Mrs. Walker, was a Times bestseller and a Waterstone Scottish Book of the Year. Yes! The follow-up, The Inheritance of Solomon Farthing, was longlisted for the McIlvenney Prize and a Historical Writers Association Gold Crown. And in 2019, Val McDermid named her one of the UK's 10 most compelling LGBTQI+ writers working today. Now, her newest book is called Emily Noble's Disgrace. It digs into the question of who cleans up once the absolute worst has happened and what that process might reveal. Now, it begins when extreme cleaner Essie Pound makes a gruesome discovery in a derelict Edinburgh boarding house. This sends her into the orbit of a young police officer called Emily Noble, who has her own reasons for wanting to solve the case. Together, they uncover the story of a forgotten family in an investigation that exposes old traumas in both of their lives. So let's just welcome our authors. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Craig, you're going to kick us off with a reading first, aren't you?
I am going to read first. I don't know if I'm too close or too far away, but there's a bit of something. It's chapter 1, so there's no real introduction needed. I will just kick off. There's one sweary word in this chapter, so I apologize for that one in advance. It's told in the first person by our lead character. I see the stranger's reflection looming in the cappy's window, large and uninvited against the rain streaks. Cringing inside, I hear the chair scrape back and the start of an unwanted conversation. I pretend I don't hear her and continue looking through the window, concentrating on the jogger splashing along the Barton Road. It doesn't work. Horrible day, isn't it? She repeats. I'm forced to turn my head and look at her over the rim of my coffee cup, nodding with a half smile. It probably seems a bit rude, but not as rude as sitting down at a table when there's already someone there. She's in her 60s, I'd say, coat dripping onto the cafe's linoleum as she wedges herself into the seat, her skin rosy and tight, glasses steamed up. Cheery, friendly, chatty, all the annoying attributes. I've only been out for 5 minutes and I'm soaked. Suppose I could have stayed in, but I get fed up with my own company. Prefer a blather with a cup of tea rather than sitting in front of the telly. Never anything worth watching anyway. Hope you've not had to come far in this. I'm Annie, by the way. All I want is a coffee and 5 minutes to myself. I think I'm entitled to that. My head's full of what lies ahead, and none of it is pleasant. I'm trying not to think about it. Can't stop thinking about it. Not too far, I tell her. Glasgow isn't a good city to live in if you're not the sociable type. People talk to people here, whether the other people like it or not. They always want to know if you're all right. They always want to know how it's going. I went to London once. You walk along the street and no one looks you in the eye. No one makes conversation with people they don't know. On the tube, at a bus stop, no one ever looks at anyone else, far less talks to them. It's great. It's not that I don't like people. It's just that I shy away from talking to the ones I don't know. Inside, I'm fine. Inside, I'm all witty answers and searching questions. Inside, I'm lovely and friendly and caring and cheerful and interested. It just doesn't come across that way. Is it your day off, love? What's your name anyway? I'm Annie. I know. It's Louise. And no, I'm just about to start work. I'm trying to get by with saying as little as I can and hoping she'll take the hint. She hasn't taken the hint. Oh, right, what is it you do then? She looks at me and at her watch as if trying to make sense of it all. These clothes, this time of day, her mind working overtime. I'm a hairdresser, I tell her. Ah, right. She smiles as if her detective work was spot on. Are you in the wee place on Down Hill Street, Louise? I've heard they're really good in there. No, I work for myself. Not in a salon. I do home visits. Oh, that would be handy. She nods appreciatively at the idea, although at the same time I can see her look at my hair and wonder why it's such a mess. It's confusing her, but she pushes past it. Getting someone to come to mind to do my hair would be lovely. I make a face. It's supposed to be apologetic, but could look like anything. I'm booked up, sorry, for ages. And I do elderly people who can't get out to a salon. She looks so disappointed. You're too young, I tell her, and do my best to smile. She takes that. Who are you going to see? I probably know them. Are you local? I'm hoping that she isn't. Oh, aye, all my days, just live 2 streets away. I shouldn't, I know I shouldn't, but I'm curious. I'm going to see Mr. Agnew, Thomas Agnew on Modder Street. She shrugs with her mouth, tasting the name but not recognising it. Don't think I know him. Nice that he's still taking care of himself, though. Anyway, I better get going. Don't want to keep Mr. Agnew waiting. I'm already on my feet, pulling my coat on and making for the door. Almost none of what I told her is true. My name's not Louise, and I'm not a hairdresser. I've no idea what I was going to say when I started to answer her, but I was never going to tell her what I really do. I don't like talking about me, so sometimes when I feel trapped, I think the only thing for it is to lie. It's wrong, I know, but it's easier that way. Safer too. The only bit that is true is that I'm on my way to Mr. Agnew's, but I'm not in quite the rush that I made out. Mr. Agnew isn't going to give 2 fucks if I'm late. He's already dead. And that's chapter 1.
Excellent.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to read from the start of Emily Noble's Disgrace as well. And this sort of follows on a little bit from where Craig has landed. I'll read the first couple of chapters because they give a little flavour of the territory we're about to get into. So, and we start with Essie Pound. Portobello, Edinburgh Seaside, 2019. We enter by the backyard, a small space surrounded by a fence rotting from the ground up. Inside, the concrete area is piled with junk. I can see old chair frames, scraps of desiccated carpet underlay, 1,000 bin bags appearing from amongst a thick stand of willow herb. The willow herb is pretty, flowers still blooming, though even I know the season is almost ended now. Daphne goes ahead, disappearing for a moment amongst a craze of thistledown. We follow, a narrow trail hacked out by the police a day or so before. The tall stems have been bent and pushed aside where the police tramped their way in and tramped their way out. I touch my hand to the nearest blossom, pink juice on my thumb. Who called the police? That's what I want to know, when the owner of the property had already waited 2 years for somebody to come. The back porch, when we get to it, is a rickety thing, open to the elements, paint peeling, glass muzzy with cobwebs. Hundreds of seashells have been piled along a narrow shelf. I count the kinds: snail, razor, limpet, surfaces chalky after so much exposure to the sun and the rain. On the ground beneath, I spy a pair of rubber boots, split and faded. Also a snake of silk, spotted with mildew, a strange sort of green. I watch as Daphne slides a key from her pocket, tackles the padlock newly fitted to the back door. When it swings open, I wonder why the police have bothered. The entrance is almost blocked by a huge cliff of rubbish, layer upon layer of one old lady's leftovers, long since abandoned to rot. We play scissors, paper, stone to decide who should go in first. I come last, of course. Monica wraps her hand around my fist, grins in triumph. Pavel laughs as he glances from my toes to my hair. I know what he's thinking. I am fat. The entranceway is narrow. Not to mention whatever might be lurking beyond. But I don't really mind. Unlike the others for whom this is just a job, I am drawn to the darker side of what we might find. First in, robed up, tiger balm beneath the nostrils. Cover your face with your mask and try to breathe through your mouth. That's what I've been taught. It's only 8:45 a.m., but already my skin is sticky as I zip my suit from crotch to chin, pull my hood over damp strands of hair. My heavy limbs chafe against the coverall's flimsy weave. Monica dabs balm on my top lip. I prefer to go in without it, face free to breathe as he breathes, but Daphne gave the order, might be a bad one, and what Daphne wants, Daphne gets. It's the reason we're the best cleaning outfit in the city, sorting the soft underbelly of Edinburgh's overlooked so that everybody else can continue on their gleaming, oblivious way. Pavel props the back door open for me. We stare at the cliff of rubbish rising from floor to ceiling and ceiling to floor. Then at the culvert carved out by its side. I take a deep breath, smell tiger balm and salt, also the fragrant scent of willow herb. Then I step over the threshold into the unknown. I'll stop there, actually.
Okay.
Leave us on a cliffhanger.
I joked earlier that we're in the like buses territory. You don't know you're looking for 2 books about extreme cleaning, or as you call it, bioremediation. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yes, as far as I know.
But here they are, and obviously they go in very, very different directions. And obviously they're not really about that. However, I want to start there because I found it fascinating. I found all the information about cleaning. I hate cleaning, but I was fascinated by the cleaning and the details. And I wonder if you can both talk to me about A, the inspiration, because I know Japan features in this, and then B, what were some of the most interesting things you discovered about this kind of work?
Well, the inspiration for me came from a magazine article that I was sent. It was a gift. And as soon as I started reading about it, I knew, you just know, there's a start of a book here. It doesn't always work out that way, and sometimes you realize there isn't a whole book in it. But when I started with this, it was a magazine article about a young woman in Japan, 23-year-old, who they call them kurokushi, which literally means lonely deaths. And their job increasingly is to clean up after someone's lain undiscovered. often it's old men without their families or without a family showing any interest. They pass away and they're not discovered for a year, longer, 2 years. And I was fascinated about who would want to do that. That was the first thing. I'm pretty sure it's not something I'd be keen to do. But this young woman, one of the things that grabbed me about it was not only that she would go in and clean, but she would try to make some kind of order from the disorder. Lonely deaths are unplanned and they're chaotic. And she would collect mementos for whatever family she could find. She we'll probably talk about them later, but she creates dioramas of little models of the room. And so immediately I felt I had a character.
Yeah.
Because the easy thing is something to get something to write about, but then you need a character. And I felt she was a gift. She's not Grace, but she's a good part of Grace. And that was my jumping off point for that.
And how long did you spend researching actual cleaning tips?
Quite a lot. You need enough to not get it wrong, I think, is the thing. And I know much more about how to clean a room that once held a dead body than is hopefully necessary. But then you never know when that kind of thing comes in handy. But I'm hoping not to use it too soon.
What about for you, Mary?
This is my third novel, and although you can read all my novels as standalones, they all inhabit this world that I call the territory of the dead in Edinburgh, which is what happens if you die with no apparent next of kin. And so my first book was about the sort of council officer who gets the job of having to get you to the point of having a funeral, which is all about establishing your identity and satisfying the fiscal and all of that kind of stuff. And my second one was all about the inheritance you leave, in this case, money. So it was about an heir hunter and someone who chases your money after your estate, after you've died with no apparent next of kin and no will. So I had already sort of thought in my mind about other people who inhabit this territory, and I had started to become interested in this idea of cleaning up. What does it mean to clean up after a life? And I started to think of that in literal terms. So what would it actually mean to go in to a space where someone has died, in whatever circumstances actually, and have to clean up? So there's literally cleaning up after the body, and then there's all the rest of the territory. All the stuff of a life, basically, whether that's in a room or a whole house or whatever it is, and where would that leave you? So to me, it was it was part of that sort of series. But the funny thing is, the minute I started thinking about that and thinking about who would do that job and what would it actually involve, etc., and you start to spend ages watching daytime TV, things like, Life of Grime and what have you, and hours on. There's a lot of stuff you can see online about hoarders' houses and all this kind of stuff, which just fascinates me. But also, I came across the same article, absolutely, and I was completely fascinated by it. And I was just saying to Craig, actually, there's also a film made by Russian television about lone death cleaners in Japan. So exactly the people that you were inspired by too. And so you do find yourself going down this quite sort of specific niche of interests. And of course, each culture does it slightly differently too, which I find really fascinating, actually.
Yeah, it's interesting because we both would probably wonder how on earth, what's the chances of someone else doing the same thing? But we don't live in a vacuum, so we end up picking up on the same things. Yeah. We'll all lead off one article to another, and then of course do completely different things with it once we get there.
Yeah, absolutely, because it's about, this is what you're saying, Lee, the cleaning and the detail of the cleaning is fascinating, and you could spend ages just going into that. But when I was starting to write Emily Noble, I did kind of think, in fact, someone said to me, I think it was my agent, she said, there's quite a lot of cleaning in the book, Mary. And I was like, well, it is actually a book about an extreme cleaner or a trauma cleaner. They all have slightly different names as well, depending on exactly which bit of the job they do, crime scene cleaner, etc. But I understood what she meant. The literal effect of cleaning something gets a bit boring after a few pages.
Yeah.
There's all the detail of it, but you have to ask why they're doing the cleaning and what's the story behind it. That's where the interesting thing lies.
Well, and as a writer, every fresh thing they have to, or every stale thing they have to clean, leads them into the next bit of the story. So I didn't think there was too much cleaning in either book. And as I say, I hate cleaning. So I was fascinated. Oh, so that's what you might do. It's also a really dangerous job because
usually,
germs and biological waste and things. It's not a safe job.
It's not. If a body's been left in a house stop us if this gets too down and grimy. If it's left for any length of time, then the room is lethal. The room's full of pathogens that will kill you. So she has to make it habitable for someone else while not getting killed herself in the process. So you need enough information to show how this would be done without bogging yourself down with it. No, sorry, down with it.
Totally. Yours is brilliant on all the detail, and I kind of, glossed over some of that, partly because in mine, it's clear right from the beginning. She says it herself that the body that's in this old boarding house has been there for at least 2 years. And depending on the conditions, I hope I'm not going to get too graphic here for anybody, but, depending on the conditions in which you've been laying, different things happen to your body. But after you've been there for a couple of years or longer, there was a famous case in Edinburgh, which was about 5 years, they reckoned, because they looked at the post. There was a huge pile of post, and they looked at the bottom of the pile of post, and that gave them a rough date. And the body has sort of dried out by then, and so you're into sort of different territory from someone who's been left for, say, a couple of days or a couple of weeks. But yeah, I mean, anyone who writes in the territory of crime finds these kind of things absolutely fascinating. And certainly for me, I was writing mine during the first lockdown. And so I was writing about a character who's constantly covered up, because they have to wear the kind of biosuits, which make them look like the police forensic crime scene people who go in and do forensics. That's how we think of them from TV, etc. But the cleaners have to do it too. They're completely covered, head to toe, masked up, gloved up, and I find that really fascinating, these characters who do this job that no one really wants to think about, but goes on all the time.
Yeah, and it worked for me because Grace, as you can probably tell from the opening chapter, is socially awkward, she's shy, so being behind a mask suits her down to the ground. She says, she described herself at one point and says she's never happier than behind a mask, so she's one step removed from the world, and that suits her. So that kind of added, it was a nice little obvious bonus.
Well, reading these books, I found myself thinking about non-fiction books I've read about, like Mrs. Wolfe and the Servants, and the way that people who had servants, they lived in the most intimate circumstances with those people, and yet they sort of pretended they weren't there. And I remembered, it's always on repeat on ITV3, you can see how exciting my life is. There's that one Poirot where one of the posh people jumps up and acts as the waiter because nobody looks at the servant. And your characters reminded me, these are people who are serving us, serving the community, and yet they're overlooked just like the dead bodies. So I was like,
yep.
I was seeing like Matryoshka dolls in the story. Yeah. And that, I think, is, I hope I'm not projecting too much, the point. Aren't you both talking about where we are as a society?
Absolutely,
and how we do or do not look after one another?
Yeah, I wanted to, immediately I wondered, what does it say of us, about us as a society, that this can happen? And it happens, unfortunately, a lot more than you would like. I wrote an article just a couple of weeks ago for The Express, and so I looked for some recent examples, and they were so easy to find. I found 3 in the last month where people had been laying for a minimum of 6 months. One of them was 2 years. And the case in Edinburgh, the news reports of that had something that comes up a lot, is they talk to the neighbours, and the neighbours say, it's such a shame, it's terrible, such a nice person, I can't believe no one noticed, right? Everyone wonders why someone else didn't notice. And it's horrendous.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think it's quite good because, as well, I think you mentioned how many funerals there are in Glasgow, and certainly I looked that up in Edinburgh, and there were at least in Edinburgh 2 or 3 a month, if not more, of council funerals of people where there was nobody else. I mean, council funerals are held, public health funerals they call them now. When I first started writing my novels, they called them indigent funerals, and before that they were called paupers funerals. So it's quite interesting how the language has changed over time in terms of how we view these things. But public health funerals are sometimes where the council pays for everything, basically. They sometimes happen because the family have no money to pay. So it's not that there's no family, but a surprising number of them are because there is literally no family and no one else to organise it, basically. So it is like this parallel universe that goes on all the time, whichever city, whichever place you live in, it will be happening. And so then there's this whole kind of workforce of people, like you describe. And I did do an event actually in last autumn where somebody came up to me afterwards and says, oh, I do that job. They didn't do the cleaning, but they did the job of kind of spearheading the council response and had to go into people's homes and decide what they were going to do with all the stuff, you know. And it was quite strange the way they sort of emerged from the audience. And they didn't, because they didn't, I did ask sort of jokingly, did anyone do the job? When we were talking like this, and she didn't reveal herself then, but she came up afterwards and spoke to me. And it is this kind of, they do it with incredible integrity and a sense of public service in some ways, but quite private, which is what you're saying about this idea of being almost a hidden job.
I think it's two sides. One, it's private and discreet, but it's also the rest of us don't want to know about it.
Yeah.
You know, we're quite happy to let someone else deal with it and not to give it any thought whatsoever, because then we don't have to deal with the collective guilt of being part of this.
Well, nobody wants to think they'll end in that situation, do they? But in fact, the way people live nowadays, more and more people living on their own.
I'm absolutely going to be found 3 years after I'm dead. And my cat, if she's still alive, is just going to be sitting there having, I picked the bones clean. I've been waiting for someone to get here.
Playing amongst the maggots.
Yeah, I think we have a maggot story.
I have a maggot story, unfortunately.
I weirdly was reading both these books thinking, that's going to be me. That's going to be me.
Well, you know what? When my first book came out, I did an event and there was an elderly lady at it, and she came and spoke to me afterwards, and she said she was one of a group of 4 old friends, and they still lived in the small town where they had all gone to school, etc., and they'd been friends for all these years. She said she was in her 80s, and she said that was what they discussed. Now, they discussed, because they lived on their own, and they had, you know, their husbands had died, etc., their children maybe weren't next door or whatever, and they were each other's little network. And she said they discussed often whether it was better to die alone at home amongst all your things, watching the telly and just living the life that you have lived and be happy with that, or whether it was better to end up in hospital where at least there was people around. And I thought, nobody wants to engage with that, but they did, because they were of the age where they were starting to think this is potentially a real thing that's going to happen.
Yeah, the real choice, and the other choice is also almost doesn't matter, because when your dead's gone, but it's. The important thing might be that you're living a lonely life before you hit that point.
It's the life before, isn't it?
It's so about the life before. And if they have their support network, they're likely to be okay. Yeah. And people can be lonely with other people, and people can be on their own and be perfectly fine. So
And there's plenty of instances of people, whether you're in a hospital or with your family around you, who you die when nobody else is in the room. And I have spoken to a researcher, an academic researcher who researches lonely deaths. That's her actual academic practice, and she had done a study where they found that was relatively common, actually, and I think that's very interesting about the human instinct, when's the right moment to go, you know.
Well, and in fact, I'm going to quote you to yourself. Grace wonders, what's worse, a man who had 3 mourners at his funeral and whose death went undiscovered, or someone whose death wasn't noticed by 30? You know, loneliness is a huge factor in both these books, and the idea that every single life might have a sad backstory.
Well, I think the key is that every life has a backstory. And I think we're all guilty of looking at old people and thinking they've always been old. You know, that they've always been 80 and they've not had a life. But they have. They've all lived and loved and done good things and bad things. And that's where we start up from there, is to our characters are very different things going on behind them. But I think exploring that was one of the things I wanted to do as well. Because I think we're all guilty of doing it to some degree or other and ignoring what's gone before. We all think we're the first people to have been born.
Yeah, absolutely. And also I'm really fascinated as well about not only that person's life, but the families or connections where they came from and the inheritance that they've brought with them, you know. And it is that weird thing, isn't it? I don't know if people have had that experience where you go to a funeral of someone who you felt you knew, or even a member of your own family, and then certain things are said in the eulogy or in the wake after, where people come up to you and you think, I've only just discovered that. but the person's dead. You know, it's like they come alive in a different way. I find that this idea of stories, which we were talking about, and which the festival is obviously stories that Macas, you know, we're talking about now. Which story tells the true story?
Yeah.
Of course, there can never be one story that tells the true story, but in marking a death, we often try to find that one story, don't we? And yet, in the moment of it, when we're celebrating the person, even then you discover it's not. There's more than one, you know?
There's a scene when Grace goes to a funeral. I think she goes to 3, so I can't remember which one it is. And they're eulogizing what a great person this man was, and she's screaming inside because she knows other things by this point. But both those sides are true.
Yeah.
We all have more than one side to us. We've all done good things and bad things. And yeah, at funerals, as a rule, people don't list the bad stuff.
No, they don't.
But you do find out new things, absolutely.
I've heard, apparently, I don't know if this is true, but in Scandinavia, I'm not sure which Scandinavian country, but there's a tradition of going up to talk to the coffin. So you would just have the coffin and there's a certain point where you can come up and you can speak to the coffin, the idea being that you're talking just to them.
Okay.
So no one else can hear, and that's the point where you can say the bad things if you want to say them, because it's your chance to sort of shrive yourself, and they can't reply, obviously, but I find that really fascinating.
That's interesting. I mean, it's a bit door bolted, horse gone.
Yes, but you see, what's interesting, which both books look at, is who's left behind.
Yeah.
You know, this idea of how you carry on someone's story and the people who are left behind and what they do with it, whether they kind of are fully aware or not, these things ripple through. And so in some ways, someone getting up and saying, well, I never said this to you in life, you know, but I'm going to say it now. You were really annoying when so-and-so happened, 25 years ago, whatever. You've had your chance to say it.
Yeah. Can I get you both to talk a little bit about it's a gift a writer gives themselves, isn't it, to write a character who's slightly on the edge of society, a character who is not so enmeshed in things that they can't take an observer's look. And Essie, and I'm going to forget the other one's name.
And Emily, you mean?
Emily, yeah sorry.
It's okay.
And Grace, they've all either disappeared or been disappeared for various reasons. Can I get you to expand on maybe a little bit about the characters themselves?
Grace lives alone, apart from her cat, George, who is based on her own cat in a really kind of odd kind of way. It's exactly our cat that's in it, except he's called Clooney. So it wasn't a wild leap to come up with the name George, so that was okay. So Grace is separate from society. She's awkward. She doesn't know how to interact with people. And that sense of being an outsider really does work, because then she's looking at the world for us, for me as a writer and for the reader. She has her own oddities, and as the book goes on, we learn a bit more about that. Her mother is dead. Her father is a violent alcoholic, and she still tends to his needs in terms of shopping and cleaning up after him. And he's a terrible person, and again, there's more backstory that arises. And I think we can all sympathize with the idea of being separate from society, because we all are to an extent. No matter how many people are around us, at the end of the day, it's us and lots of strange people that surround us. And being able to look at it that way gives you a good starting point. And I think she had to be lonely, from a writer's point of view, she had to be lonely to clean up after lonely deaths. That just fitted, and I wanted her to fit that with that kind of symmetry. So that was my starting point for Grace, and then she became things I didn't expect as well along the way.
Oh, did she? She surprised you?
Well, she did a bit. I started writing mine in the third person, and I've written about 5 or 6 chapters, and it was okay, but it hadn't come alive the way I wanted it to. And I thought, well, that kind of growing that means I'm going to have to do more work. I went back and started to write it from that chapter, and immediately I knew who she was in a way that I didn't before. So that really worked from my point of view.
Yeah, that's funny. That happened to me too. I started writing Essie in the third person, and then I had to go back and put her into the first person fairly early on to try and penetrate who she was as a character. It's something about them being quite withholding characters, and then they're doing this job that is on the edge of society almost, that they do on their own or with a cleaning crew. But even Essie is part of a cleaning crew, the company. But even so, it's not like they're all together in a room. You know, she'll do one room, somebody else will do another room, someone else is doing the upstairs, etc. You know, and she is absolutely the same kind of thing. She's a very withheld and withdrawn character, really annoying to write because I had no idea about her, and then that's the point of her character, you know. And the reason is because she's cut off from her past. So she's a child who's grown up in foster care, and she knows nothing about her family, her biological family or her roots, essentially. And so the novel is, and her kind of interaction with this old lady's boarding house in Portobello, where she has to sift through mounds and mounds and mounds of rubbish to clear up, but which of course is an excavation of a person as well, is essentially where she starts to excavate herself. It comes up against the point in her life where she's going, I have to try and excavate myself, discover whatever I can about myself, and so the book sort of follows that process really of self-discovery, and then she comes up against this young police officer, Emily Noble, who she's part of a team supposedly because she's in the police force, so she's part of something. She's part of society in that way, and yet she feels completely separated from it. Yeah. And in fact, she's sort of got herself into trouble in ways that mean that the rest of her team slightly ostracize her. And you have to ask the question of why she's ended up there. Has she sort of almost deliberately put herself there? And so, I have both these characters. It is brilliant as a writer to write characters like that because the way they observe society is from the outsider position. And so they can ask questions that people going about their everyday life and their normal way of doing things wouldn't particularly ask, but also the observation thing.
Exactly.
They can observe certain stuff, the detail of life, what I call it, the stuff of life, in a way that the rest of us would just ignore.
And also Grace thinks, and therefore, because we're in first person, says, she thinks stuff that we all would like to say out loud. She's very like, oh, screw this.
Yeah. And occasionally she slips up, and I know I've done that. Hang on, did I say that out loud? Right, okay, never mind. But there was in the original article that I read, there was something that led me to the cleaner's separation from society. She talked about having a boyfriend, and she'd said, well, her last boyfriend, and she said it in a way that meant it'd been a while, couldn't stand the smell of bleach. Yeah. And you're thinking, well, maybe that is what put him off, but maybe it's what she's doing every day. And he's then got to, so if you've got that kind of job and there's other jobs that people do, it's hard for other people to get their heads around it, I think. So it maybe creates a solitary person and someone that's at odds with society. Yeah. So again, I wouldn't want to do it.
How do you end up there? I mean, Essie says it's because it's a job she can get. She doesn't have many qualifications, and it's basically better paid in terms of the pantheon of cleaning jobs. And she gets extra for brain matter, is how she phrases it. Do you know what I mean? And so from her point of view, she sees it in this kind of quite practical way, but of course it isn't about that. No. It's because she's putting herself in the place of people that she somehow has an affinity with, which of course is exactly what Grace is doing as well. Yeah.
Well, because the people who are dead and undiscovered are not the only disappeared people. There are many disappeared parents. You know, Grace's mother. Yeah. What happened to her? Where is she gone? A girl growing up in foster care. What happened there? Where's her family? There's so many layers of disappearance. It's like a tiramisu of death and disappearance here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I'm fascinated with that, and as well as Essie not really understanding her own past, and Emily knowing about her past and wanting to sort of avoid it, basically. So they're quite similar, but for different reasons. Yes, in the house, who is the person who's died? I mean, when I first started writing my first book, I was interested in the kind of detective-style job of what you do if you find someone who's died with no next of kin. I just thought that job is really interesting. How do you actually identify someone and find family for them and what kind of funeral would you have? But then I kind of thought, but who's the dead person? I mean, who actually are they, and which truth is going to be revealed? And so in my book, the boarding house in which they found the old lady, and what they find in there is a story in itself about her.
Yeah.
And where she's come from, and why maybe a question of why she's ended as she has. I think I always leave a slight question mark over that. Why have people ended in that situation, you know?
And everybody has a story. You know, it's often said that everybody has a novel in them, and I'm not sure that's true, but everybody has a story.
Yeah.
And Grace gets annoyed that no one seems to care. You know, no one cares about Tommy Agnew's life or his death. So she cares, and it's part of her fault is she cares, and she cares too much. And in the room where he died, she finds an old photograph from the 60s of 4 young men together. And immediately she knew, well, of course he's had a life, of course he's grown up. And she finds other things in the room, newspapers from a date, and her curiosity's grabbed. And of course Tommy has a backstory. And it's maybe not all that she thought it might be.
No, but I'm going to skip past location for now.
Okay.
And because we're talking about things found at the scene of the cleaning, let's talk about possessions. Let's talk about various things, such as the difference between hoarding and collecting.
Yeah.
Yes.
Let's talk about, because you each have, so you've got all the newspapers, Grace has a collection of objects in her home that are her special things. She creates dioramas of the jobs she's done. Mary, there's a very important dressing gown in this, which again, because all your books share DNA, brought me back to the first book, where the dress was very, very vitally important. So let's talk about possessions. I have a personal interest in how possessions are personality markers. Mm-hmm. That may be
Absolutely.
a side issue.
I think it changes as we get older. I think, and this is very much a generalization, younger people tend to be, it's here today, we've not got to worry about things. As you get older, possessions have a meaning, and you're more likely, I think, to hold on to things, even though you know you shouldn't. This is almost separate from recycling things, but I know people who are very important to me who will use recycling as an excuse for not throwing anything out. But and there's a very fine line between hoarding and collecting and keepsakes. But possessions are imbued with memories, and they're important to us, for good and for bad. So I think my wife died 15 years ago now. So it took me over a year before I cleaned out things like wardrobes and closets, because I just could not bring myself to do it. And eventually my niece came over and said, right, let's do it. And every single thing she picked out, I could remember going to a restaurant or a night at a bar or something, and I was like, would they need to all to go in the bag? I cannot look at them one at a time, because they all mean something. And I think we can use that, though, and we do.
Oh, yeah, totally. And I also think that, I think maybe one of the reasons why you can be a collector in one way and then somebody else who collects is a hoarder is to do with the reasons why you've ended up keeping hold of stuff. Because quite often the thing with hoarders is that it's to do with your ability to manage life. Mm-hmm. I think I read a brilliant book, a memoir, when I was researching for Emily Noble, and it was about a woman who runs a trauma cleaning company in Australia, and that part of what she did wasn't just crime scenes and scenes where people had died. She would go regularly. She had regular contracts with people who were essentially hoarders, and they just needed someone to help them at least keep the passageways clear, in their house. And she described, there's this brilliant chapter where she describes negotiating over a CD. A bit like you're describing, but for a different reason. Yep. That they just, to them, every single thing felt important, but that included sort of empty washing up liquid bottles, or a CD that had lost its cover and no one actually knew what it was, and they didn't even have a CD player, or if they did have a CD player, it was so buried in stuff they couldn't find it, or they couldn't get to a socket to plug it in. And that is a kind of very interesting pathology, I think, about how you live your life. And their perception of managing life is completely different from ours. So anyone else would go in and go, oh, wow, this is too much. How can you live like this?
Yeah.
But to them, they did live like that. They did find a way to get to their cooker or their kettle or their chair in the living room or their TV remote or whatever it was that was still important to them to be able to do. And in some ways, the character in my book who's died in the house, that's what she's done.
Yeah.
Life has sort of encroached. And you get a sense of that actually in the book, of the story of the house. You see the house at different points. And so you realise that life has encroached and encroached and encroached until she's literally living in these little passageways.
Yeah.
You know,
And it's a house
fascinating.
that has other secrets that I'm not going to talk about.
Yeah.
The house itself, beyond the things you can see, has darker secrets.
Yeah, absolutely. Just saying one thing about objects, I have actually got a couple
yeah.
here with me. Let's see if I can get them out. When I write my books, before I start them, I have an idea of what I'm thinking about writing, but I don't know the detail of it or anything about the characters and where they're going to end up. But I quite often find an object in my stuff, or I come across it somewhere, or a photograph or whatever, and I think, oh, that's my book, but I haven't written the book yet, so I don't quite know what that is. But I had these two little ladies here, these two little dolls. Look, she's got her hands up already. These are like Pippa dolls, which I used to play with in the 1970s, and I had them sitting in the place where I write. And I looked at them when I was thinking of this book, and I thought, oh, these represent my book. Somehow or other, these two little dolls, these characters, if you like, represent my book. And so the next chapter on, actually, from the one that I read, Essie Pound describes coming across a kind of seam of plastic in all this rubbish and a little pair of doll's feet pointing out at her. And she becomes, it's not really giving anything away to say she's a bit of a thief. And so she likes to take things from the scene of houses that she cleans. And the doll speaks to her, and so she liberates the doll and has the doll. And so having lived in this house, it then sort of goes to Essie's house and becomes one of her possessions. So imagine then if she was dead and somebody found the doll and then took the doll on somewhere else. So the doll retains all of those different people's stories, but nobody necessarily knows them. They add their own story to it each time. I find that really fascinating, actually.
It is odd how objects have more to them than their physicality. I wrote a book about 4 books ago about murderabilia. So people buy and sell items collected to killers. And I bought a piece of rock from the house in Cielo Drive where the Manson family killed Sharon Tate and friends. And they demolished the fireplace, and I bought a bit of the fireplace. And I did an event in Berkeley. And I offered, I've talked about, is it just a piece of stone? And I asked if anyone in the front row wanted to touch it, and they all completely recoiled.
Yeah.
And then I admitted that although I do have that piece of rock at home, the one I brought there I took from someone's garden on the way over. And they're all like, okay, that's fine then. Well, what's the difference? It's just a piece of stone, but it's not. And those objects can be different depending on where they've been.
Yeah, absolutely. They're kind of somehow imbued with something.
Yeah.
Well, they're imbued with our imaginations, aren't they? So
Yes,
all of the people
yes.
sitting in the front row put their imagination into that piece of stone, even though it wasn't the piece of stone. And how would you know it was the piece of stone anyway? I mean, what was the authentication thing?
The people who, I could have bought just a piece of stone. This is entirely possible. But I am assured by the place that I bought it from that provenance, that's the word I'm trying to find, that the provenance was all properly dealt with.
Yeah. It is totally fascinating. And I remember an event where somebody came and she was sorting out the house. I think her husband had died, and she'd got to the point where she was deciding whether to sort the house out or not. And she'd got to that point where, as an older person, she wanted to let it all go. Yeah. And I have come across that with some people want to hold on to it all, and some people want to start to let it all go. But there's a key moment where you're still able to let it all go, and if you pass that moment, it's just too much for you, basically.
I really would rather this wasn't being filmed if I was telling this story, but my neighbour 2 doors away, it's an old lady in her 90s, and occasionally, if the front door's open, you can see yellowing stacks of newspapers up the hall. And she continues to wash and hang out on the washing line carrier bags. And they've been washed so often that there is no brand markings on them. I don't think she's doing it for recycling, even though that would be a perfectly good reason to do it. She just can't let them go. Yeah. And obviously some of that fed into the
Yeah.
I'll deny it in public, but some of that fed into
Because this
what I
isn't
was
in
writing.
public. Nobody
No,
here,
this is fine. No one tell
nobody
anyone.
here will talk.
But it's so fascinating to ask that question, isn't it? Why? Why that object? Where has that come from? I mean, that's what I'm interested in, is if you reveal the past of a character and then maybe other generations going back, which even they don't understand or know about, you start to understand what the significance of that particular object.
There's
for
a
them.
line in the book when Grace talks about other things she's found in the houses that people have collected, and she talks about an old woman who had collected every train ticket that she'd ever used.
Yeah.
And I think the line was that automatic barriers had been the death of her. But the collecting thing is true, because it's a fellow crime writer's husband that does that. And he doesn't know why, but once you get to a certain point with stuff, you can't stop it. He has every train ticket he's ever used, until, of course, they get retained now. But he is a bit strange.
At least you can keep them in quite a small box.
Yeah.
Well,
You know,
exactly.
here's the stuff that's
He has
bigger.
hundreds of them.
Oh, goodness.
So he needs a bigger house, a room of train tickets.
No, he needs psychiatry.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Before I have more questions, but it occurs to me I haven't asked any of you if you have questions for our writers. There's a bit of glare, but if you wave your arms, otherwise I'm quite happy to carry on, but you know, this is audience participation moment, so if anybody has a question. Okay, we have one back there. Oh, hang on, there's a roving mic as well. Well, otherwise nobody will hear you. Okay, so in other words, is there a socio-economic factor to a lonely death?
I think it can happen to anyone. In my experience of it, it's more about well, no, I was going to say what it says about them as a person. That's maybe unfair, about the circumstances. It's if you're separate from society, whether the amount of money you have in the bank's not going to change that. It's happening. Did you see the one in Italy just last week?
No, I didn't. No, I haven't seen that.
This old lady who's found dead at her dining table, having dinner, died during the meal, and was found last week, 2 years later. And she lived in a very nice villa, and yeah, it can happen to anyone.
Yeah, I totally agree with you about that. I think it's easy to imagine it's connected to poverty, but it isn't, actually. I don't think it is. There was a famous case in Edinburgh of a man who died in quite a wealthy part of Edinburgh, which seems to surprise people, that someone would die and not be found until a bit later on in those circumstances, or to be found and then they can't quite track down any kind of family. But why not? You know, why wouldn't you be? Just because you've got a big house and money in the bank doesn't necessarily mean that you live your life connected to anybody. And he was worth an absolute fortune. And in the end, they traced a relative who lived in America and had not had any contact with him for many, many, many years. And she came over, proved who she was. I think maybe she did turn up for the funeral, one of the only people who did, and walked away with all the money. And yet had zero connection with him at all. So it crosses all the people I've ever spoken to who deal in this world, and particularly the police officers in Edinburgh, who used to be the ones who would go in the house first, and they used to have to sort of try and find a relative in the first instance. And they said it crosses all circumstances.
I think it's more that society has changed. The flat that Grace goes to at the beginning is in a traditional tenement flat in Partick. And going back, and it's easy, we're talking a bit with rose-tinted specs on, but if you go back 40 years, everybody in that tenement would have known everyone else. They would have gone in and out of each other's houses and the doors wouldn't have been locked. And it's just not like that anymore. People would have stayed for generations, it would have passed down to the children, and now people move around more, they're more isolated from each other, and it's more likely that something goes on behind the door, someone dies, and no one, until there's a smell or until there's a water leak, and no one thinks to look.
And also the other thing I would say is that people live longer now, and so people will outlive their families. That's quite common. When I was looking at heir hunting and this question of why there are so many estates, I mean, if you leave an estate that's worth less than £2,000, no one even bothers to publicise it or chase it. If you leave an estate that's worth more than £2,000, it's publicly available knowledge for anyone to kind of try and find a relative if they can. It basically, a lot of people outlive their spouses and become, if they don't have children, then they outlive their friends, you know, and that is just a normal circumstance now because people live longer.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Okay, we started slightly after the hour, so let's very, very quickly, in 2 or 3 minutes, talk setting. Yours takes place in Glasgow and on Bute, and yours takes place not just in Edinburgh, but in Portobello.
Yes.
So can you tell me why you made those selections?
My books have always been set in Glasgow, apart from one, so that was a natural place for me to start. I wanted to, because we're telling a different story, I wanted that story to go to a different place. Bute is somewhere I grew up knowing. I used to go every summer. My granny's sister had a flat, so we used to go every summer. I've ended up going back, run a crime festival there, Bute Noir, for the last 5 years. And when in my head, just making up as I went along, Grace found a photograph of these 4 young men. I suddenly knew where I wanted them to be. And it took me in my head to a time and a place in the 60s where this story could be told, where Tommy was a young man. And islands are always great places to set crime scenes on because of their isolation and not being able to get off. It's a great place, and I wanted to go back there. Yeah. And it also means some of my trips there are now tax deductible, so that helps. That helps as well.
Yeah, and I love that actually because mine is set in. All my books start off in Edinburgh and then go other places, but mine is set this time in Portobello, which is a sort of seaside of Edinburgh, basically. And it's set more specifically in a big old house on the promenade, which used to be a boarding house. And of course, just like Bute, Portobello was the place where you would go for the fair holiday in July. People from Edinburgh or the East Coast would come to Portobello, and it was this incredible kind of thriving seaside resort, basically. And I wanted in some ways to show how that has changed over the years and the kind of ups and downs of that and how that has impacted on this big house. And that's why I picked a big house that used to be a boarding house, because think of all the people who've washed in and out of that place over the many, many years, you know, and then think of what happens to a house like that when there is no seaside holiday trade anymore. You know, who ends up inhabiting it then? And then what happens when there's one person left in it? You know, I mean, nowadays, of course, it's probably worth millions of pounds, actually. Yeah. A big house on Portobello Promenade, looking out over the sea with nothing else in front of it but the beach. I mean, you know, there's also a story of gentrification, which is what's happened in Portobello now. And hovering behind it is the story of something that happened in Portobello I've placed it in the 90s. It's based on a real thing that happened in the 80s, which was described by the detective at the time as the death of Portobello, you know, because nobody will want to go there anymore. And the books are kind of connected, aren't they, in some ways? I won't say any more about this idea of things that happen in these kind of environments where it's difficult to pin down exactly what's happened and who's responsible, you know, but they permeate through a small society like that. Very fascinating.
There's also a thing, and I'm going to give us both credit for having meant this and thought about it in advance, because I'm sure we both did, but both Portobello and Bute are kind of metaphors for something that was youthful and vibrant and has now become faded and forgotten, and so have the elderly and older characters that we were talking about.
So it all comes back.
I absolutely meant all of that from the start. Yeah.
Absolutely, it was all deliberate.
Right, so in closing, I just want to remind you that you'll all be sent an online evaluation, and if you could fill that in and send it back, that would be terrific. And there's also a live chat on YouTube where you could follow the link, I think, to the same evaluation, because we want to know what you've liked. I'm sure there's nothing you dislike, but you might have suggestions for what can happen in the future with the festival. And again, go to other events, visit the pop-up bookshop, or go to bookshop.org. Now, before I encourage you to race to the back and get books and get them signed. Can we say thank you to our authors?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.